Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you today? Good to see you.
Good morning, Frank. Good to see you too. So it's been an eventful time since we last talked, and it's difficult to tell whether it's a problem of democracy or leadership, whether we're talking about, well, because the main problem is in Europe and Brexit, and it seems as though people just can't agree on how to do things in a democratically participatory way. But then a lot of people will say it's not the problem of the people who have to vote, it's the problem of the leadership and what it gives them to vote on. And that's an interesting diagnosis of a new sort of situation. But I think it's the sort of thing that may be happening in a number of places, and it's partly the fact, I think we go through periods of history when we're short of good leaders. But I think that also in the modern age, more and more people are taking an active part in all sorts of democratic decision-making processes, which is making democracy more difficult. Mm-hmm. However, I have to say that what's been on my mind most recently is that I keep on getting emails from people who, at the bottom of their signature, add she, her, hers, or he, him, his. As if I need to know what gender they are, or they need to make sure that I use the right gender in talking to them.
Oh my! I've not had that experience. That's very interesting. I have not had that experience yet.
And I haven't got around to doing the same thing myself yet. I think I'll remain of indeterminate gender.
Okay.
If people can't make up their own minds, it doesn't matter. So that's one thing. And of course, if we were speaking a language like Persian, which doesn't make a distinction between he and she, we wouldn't have this problem. So I don't know whether there's the same problem in any of the other languages that I'm familiar with, because I haven't been in a French or German situation recently where it would be clear. So that's one thing. Another thing is that I find that people don't know anymore in English whether to say I or me. Do you say between you and I, or between you and me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, objects and prepositions are lost on people.
Now, and the reason, of course, is that our education system simply isn't working anymore, mm-hmm. At least not as far as language is concerned. And I think the main reason for this is the fact that there is really no properly organized or properly constituted framework for the revision of the educational curriculum. And up until the 1960s, and I was in the educational curriculum from 1940 till I got my doctorate in 1967, and up until 1963, it was impossible to get a good degree anywhere without the knowledge of Latin. You couldn't go to Oxford without Latin. And so you learned Latin grammar, and you also starting in grade school, mm-hmm. and continuing in high school, you had classes in English grammar, mm-hmm. and English grammar was based on Latin grammar.
Okay.
And the reason, of course, is that up until the 18th century, anybody who was educated still functioned in Latin. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so that
let me just interrupt you. It's funny that you mentioned that, because I'm fairly sure this still exists. It existed as of 2 years ago. There is a website actually sponsored by the British government. I'll send you the link, that offers classes, web classes, tutorials in basic Latin, with the whole idea being that this is a way for an average English citizen to be able to grasp the rudimentary basics of Latin so that he or she are better than able to understand the historical texts of England that might be available in libraries. Um,
Very
yeah, I'll send you the link. I'll send you the link later today. But it's quite a concise Latin grammar. It's not like Wheelock's Latin text, which is floating around somewhere in this room here. But it's quite useful if one is interested in learning the basics of Latin, and it's a British government site.
Very interesting. And I'm assuming that the American government doesn't have a similar site.
Oh, of course, no. I don't think the American government has a similar site for English.
Anyway, the next thing I was going to say is that correct language was always written language.
Mm-hmm.
One was supposed to speak as one wrote, and the relationship between written language and spoken language has been changing, I think. That is, the primacy of written language is losing its primacy. This is, I think, all has to do with the way everything is changing in the modern world. I mean, part of the fact is that, of course, in schools now, I understand people are not taught to write cursively.
That's right.
The keyboard is the way you write. My daughter, who writes very neatly, doesn't write cursively. She prints.
Oh, really?
And
Okay.
She's 30 years old.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I could never write neatly with whatever I was writing, and I can barely write legibly anymore anyway. But I certainly was taught to write cursively.
Well, written language now is moving much closer to oral. Written communication is moving much closer to oral communication, and I think.
And this, of course, means that there is ceasing to be a standard form of English.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the whole point of written language being the standard language was that everything that's written stays with you.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that's spoken leaves us. It's ephemeral.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, of course, what happens in other parts of the world, in other languages as well. And the reason that the Persian language has been so important in world history is that it was the singular written language all the way from Iraq to northern China for a millennium, and still is a very important written language, despite what's happened to that part of the world in the 20th century. And of course, another part of this is that Chinese, which has been an important written language since the third millennium, even though it was not used for everyday affairs until 2,000 years ago, they've been arguing for decades now about whether they should stop writing in characters and start writing in some other form. And they can't make up their minds because of the relationship between characters and identity, and the problem of how to do things in such a way that would be standard for all the different ways of speaking in a country of 1.4 billion people.
Well, this is a very disturbing trend because, especially of late, when leaders of countries, I'm thinking, of course, of the United States, treat their oral utterances as yesterday's newspapers. All right. Oh, I said that last week, so that no longer matters. What I'm saying now matters. And if this is going to be the new standard of trust, I mean, communication, and you would know better than I, was communication, whether it be oral and then subsequently written, was developed as a means for humans to be able to establish links with each other and rely on each other so that on a common ground they could begin to advance and progress. And if you don't have that security and confidence that what you're saying is understood seriously by the hearer, and that the listener is then going to be in a position where he or she is going to do something based on the confidence that they have in what you just said, then things stall, they stop, they don't progress. And in a funny way, whether or not what we're talking about now is, it may be a symptom of the inability of government to function, as well as a whole host of other things, or perhaps the government not functioning and the whole host of other things are a symptom of the inability of people to communicate in a formalized manner any longer. I don't know what the answer is.
Well, I think it's once again, it takes us back to something we talk about on and off in various contexts, which is the organization in the modern world. That we really have, I mean, I've said already that the curriculum just hasn't changed in the last 50 years, even though what's taught in every course is different, and some courses that used to be taught aren't taught anymore. Nevertheless, there's no real difference in the structure of the curriculum. Mm-hmm. And what we need is for each country or each linguistic system to have some sort of organization that considers what is necessary for people to have learned as they grow up in order to be able to function in a society which shares a form of language. And it's certainly very different from what it was 50 years ago.
Does the language, I'm sort of trying to articulate this here in language. I'm wondering whether or not the inability to and I will say inability, because when I, as you know, I'm in an education program now with people who are a third my age almost, and I have some difficulty communicating with them. So I'm just wondering whether or not, if we have a government or a set of institutions, whether they be religious or governmental or cultural, that is communicating with the population as a whole. And just 1 second. If that level of institutions, or if they're incapable of communicating effectively with the population, what does that mean? I mean, and also vice versa. If the population itself can't communicate with the institutions, which is what I think is going on in a number of ways, people just becoming apathetic. I mean, Brexit they voted to leave. It can't occur. People are throwing their hands up, walking away, saying the government is incompetent. In the United States, I mean, whatever happened in November 2016 happened. People are throwing their hands up, walking away, saying everything is impossible to deal with. I mean, we're seeing it all around the world. There's this chasm, and we always talk about globalization being one of the reasons, and that the people can react faster than the deeply entrenched institutions. But it also may be simpler than that. It may be that the two can't communicate any longer.
Well, it's also involves something else we talked about, which is the loss of formality. So you can say anything anywhere, and the way you talk has nothing to do with the person you're talking to. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, all forms of communication are, what shall I say, losing their structure, so that less is being actually communicated, even though the words may seem to be the same.
Well, I would agree with that. What do you think the next steps are?
Well, I don't know. I mean, because I'm basically an optimist, so I would like to think that sooner or later we'll work out a solution to these things. But I can't at the moment see how it's going to be done, because neither in this country nor, so far as I know, in England do we have the basis on which we could build some sort of structure for a reformulation of the educational curriculum. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And even so, if we did, it would take a long time for it to have any effect.
Oh, it would take quite a long time. I mean, just even in the United States, when George W. Bush instituted the Common Core standards or whatever they're called, 12, 15 years ago. I mean, those are still being fought over today by teachers and school
But
boards.
it's particularly important that it be done for English,
Mm,
because English is being used by more people every day.
right, right.
Becoming probably one can say it has become a global language, and seems to be growing in a more predictable way than any other language. But if it grows in a way that doesn't make it universally comprehensible and efficiently usable, then we're not going to be any better off. So,
Well,
sorry to end on a note that doesn't sound very optimistic. We'll try
well,
and
it's okay. Good. Well, you deserve every so often ending in a non-optimistic manner. That's fine. So good. All right. Well, Professor, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy this nice spring day, and we'll look forward to talking next week. Thank you.
good. See you then.
Bye.